Hello everybody and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. It's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the developments on the political and literal battlefields. So let's go ahead now and get started. Ukraine launched a simultaneous strike on 4 air bases deep inside Russian territory. The attack aimed at suppressing Russian Air Force and helping secure troops in Kursk from Russian airstrikes.
Ukrainian drones struck targeted Russian air bases on Wednesday night. One facility in the Kursk region, one in the Nizhny Novgorod region, and 2 in the Voronezh region were targeted by large waves of drones. As the long-range drones are slow-moving, Russian forces usually have time to move aircraft away from their usual parking spot, shielding them from attack. The same cannot be said of fuel storage tanks, which are often targeted by Ukrainians. Strikes against air bases disrupt Russian air operations, complicating strikes against Ukrainian forces operating within the Kursk region. According to sources within the Ukrainian government quoted by Reuters, this was the largest single drone attack conducted by Ukraine on Russian soil.
A fire broke out at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant on Sunday. No increase in radiation was detected in the surrounding area.
Ukraine and Russia have accused each other of starting the fire under one of the cooling towers of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukraine claimed that the Russians set tires on fire in an act of provocation, while Moscow said that Ukrainians attacked the facility with a drone. The inspection conducted by the personnel of the International Atomic Energy Agency found no sign of either drones or tires. The cooling towers are located a fair distance away from the nuclear reactors, and as such, the fire posed no significant danger to the facility. Areas surrounding the plant recorded no signs of abnormally high radiation.
Politico reports that the United States is considering providing Ukraine with cruise missiles. The missiles in question are comparable to the previously provided Storm Shadow munitions.
According to Biden administration officials quoted by Politico, the White House is open to providing Ukraine with Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, or JASSM for short. The munitions could be launched from newly provided F-16 fighter jets and strike targets up to 370 kilometers away. Ukraine previously received similar Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom and France, with a somewhat longer range of 550 kilometers. Newer versions of the JASSM can reach as far as 925 kilometers, although the United States usually provides Kyiv with older versions of its weapons. Ukraine is currently conducting a bombing campaign against air bases deep inside Russian territory using drones. These are slow and inaccurate and therefore cause limited damage. If JASSM missiles could be used instead, the Russian Air Force's capability to launch sorties against Ukraine could be significantly degraded.
Ukrainian troops pushing into Russia's Kursk region are capturing large numbers of Russian soldiers. This will allow Kyiv to exchange prisoners of war for its soldiers captured by Russia.
Entire Russian platoons have been surrendering in the Kursk region, something unseen in the static trench combat of the eastern and southern fronts. The scale of surrenders may be explained by the fact that Kursk is defended by second-rate Russian units, including conscripts. Additionally, the dynamic mode of the fighting allows for small-scale encirclements. While prisoner exchanges have been taking place regularly, Russia has captured more Ukrainians than vice versa throughout the full-scale invasion, complicating the process for Kiev. Russian soldiers captured in Kursk will allow Ukraine to free more of its fighters captured by Russia.
Recent attacks on Crimea and the situation in the east. Let's now move to Kyiv, and with us our correspondent Oz Chatterjee. Hello, Oz. Now, can you fill us in on the situation in Crimea, what it looks like there?
So the Russians have claimed today that overnight the Ukrainian tried to target Crimea around the Kerch Bridge area. The Russians are now claiming that 12 ATACMS, that's the Army tactical missile system, very long-range missiles sent by the United States of America, the Russians are claiming they downed 12 of them. Now, these are quite expensive missiles. Ukraine doesn't have a lot of them. And Russia is notorious for lying about successfully downing and how many numbers they've downed. But nevertheless, we do have a claim from Russia that 12 ATACMS missiles were deployed by Ukraine last night. Now, you know, I'm skeptical of that claim in and of itself, of the 12 being downed, shall we say. But there was definitely an attack overnight in Crimea. The Kerch Bridge was disrupted. You know, the normal social media videos erupt around there whenever there's some sort of attack. So it does go to show that while there are things going on, obviously, in Kursk and around the country, that Crimea isn't far from the thought of the SBU and the Ukrainian armed forces.
Right, and Ukraine's got to keep the pressure on them everywhere they possibly can. Now, if we look at the situation in the east, of course, there are people saying that Russians have been redeploying some of their forces from the east to respond to the situation unfolding in Kursk. So what can you tell us about what the situation in the east currently looks like along the front lines?
So, yeah, we've heard that news from Ukrainian sources, from the White House as well this week, saying that they had noticed troops being deployed away from the front lines in the east of the country, and other parts of Ukraine being pulled back into Russia to try and reinforce Kursk. However, as we understand it, Ukraine is still losing territory in Donetsk, particularly in areas like Barros, where the situation has been difficult for many months now for the Ukrainian defenders. You know, so while this operation is having some success, clearly that success still is not reaching those most critical areas where Russia's still trying to push home its advantage in these regions. No less up in the fight sitting in either direction at the moment either. So it's unclear when anything will stabilize in this direction. And it's true that while what's going on in Kursk has changed the narrative, it is definitely also pulling resources away from those very critical defenses of towns and cities in the east of Ukraine.
Right. Well, it seems that this weekend we're at a crossroads. We'll have to see where next week takes us in this latest mission in Kursk and, of course, along the front lines in the east. Oz Chatterjee, thank you very much for joining us and telling us about the recent developments there in Ukraine on Ukraine this week. And we continue to stay in Ukraine. We're connected live with war correspondent Piotr Kaszuwara, a journalist for Onet PL and Polish Radio 357, who's right now in the northeastern Ukrainian region of Sumy, just near where that incursion into Kursk has taken place. Hello, Piotr. Thanks for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you for the invitation. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, now tell me, what is exactly the current situation? We talked to you just a couple days ago, but this incursion, if you will, it's lasted beyond many expectations. So what are you seeing on the ground right there where you're at?
So situation changes all the time. Every day we hear something new, but we still don't know too much, because this is the point. This operation in Kursk region need to be kept in secret a little bit. Even because of that, we do not receive too many informations, but we can tell at least something. For now, we know that Ukraine continue taking new territories. Now they own control about 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory, and they are preparing to set their own military administration in the city of Sudzha, one of the first cities that Ukraine took in this very spectacular, we can say, offensive. They set their own general in there to deal with the civilians mostly. This is the goal, because there is thousands of people who needs help, because in Kursk region, in the Ukrainian controlled territory, now there is no electricity, no water, no phones, no connection, no internet, no food for the people. So what Ukraine is trying to organize right now is humanitarian aid for all these people who decide to stay. And also in a couple of days, Ukraine will try to open the green corridor for all the civilians who would like to escape from the war zone. Probably some of them will decide to go to Russia, and some of them maybe will decide also to go to Ukraine, because all the soldiers who I have been talking to, who just came back from the assault, they said that people are welcoming them. And this is very surprising, because they actually know that this is the Ukrainian army, but still most of them, they are not protesting, they are even waving. The soldiers have been very surprised, because the women and the children, they are waving to them. Probably some of them, they are doing that because they are afraid, they don't want to be killed, they don't want to die. But even soldiers sometimes, they are unhappy that they cannot say nothing. They are unhappy to help to Russians, but the orders from the military administration, from their commanders, is to support people, even they are Russians, even they are enemies, even they have been supporting invasion on Ukraine for a long time.
Right, it's certainly a very interesting turn of events there. We've seen some of the images of them handing out humanitarian aid. I imagine, as you say, that when they open up the green corridors, that those actions will step up and more aid will get to the civilians that are still there, despite the Russian claims that they've evacuated hundreds of thousands of citizens from the area, from the region. Thursday night, we saw something interesting. We saw a foreign journalist, the first foreign journalist from Italian TV, go to Sucha and actually do some live reports from there. Subsequently, Russia has charged her with certain charges relating to illegally crossing the state border. She's had threats to her lives. How is it for journalists? What are the risks involved if they go and indeed go with the armed forces of Ukraine and cross the border and report on this offensive?
There is always a risk of being killed by the rocket, because the Russian army keeps continue shelling and bombing all the territory. Even this is a Russian territory, and this is still active war going on over there. So it's very difficult to get there. But still, Suja, what I have been told by the soldiers, it's kind of back zone already for the offensive. So some of the people who are going there, they don't even need to wear bulletproof jackets, for example, because it's not that scary as it was at the beginning. But still, I understand the international law, and we obviously have been also thinking to go to Suja, to cross the border, to see what is going on there, to talk to the Russians as well, to see everything what we have been told by the soldiers. But we haven't been sure. We have been consulting that with the lawyers as well. And we decide to don't go because it's still a bit dodgy, to cross the border, because officially this is illegal, and officially Russia actually can sue people who are crossing the border illegally without any documents. So maybe the situation will change as far as Ukraine will set up their own military administration in Suja, and maybe then they can give us some kind of permissions, temporary permissions. Right now, if you are a journalist and you want to go there, you need to ask us. As the one of the Ukrainian journalists did, you have to ask for the special permission from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and you obviously have to be taken there by military. But still, according to the international law, it will be very difficult to do it without getting this kind of troubles as the Italian journalists did. But, it's still interesting because, as we have seen many times, Russian journalists, for example, or pro-Russian journalists from occupied territories in Donetsk region have been traveling to the occupied territories.
And even other
Ukraine.
Westerners, even other Western so-called journalists have also done that.
Yes, it's true. So I don't know how does it work, and why we actually cannot go there. But still, this is very important operation. And obviously, as we are journalists, we are interested to go there. We want to see on our own eyes. We want to show you the pictures. We want to show you the movies. We want to tell you what is really going on there, because everything what we have right now are kind of opinions, kind of relations made by the soldiers. Some of them, they are disinformation as well, propaganda communicate. So it would be really, really good to go and see everything on our own eyes. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for this operation, we need to wait.
Yep, definitely it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Well, Piotr Koshuvara, journalist for ONAP-PL and Radio 357, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your report for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
The Ukrainians are taking steps to coordinate ongoing operations in the Kursk region while continuing to highlight Ukrainian progress. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with the Ukrainian High Command on August 15th and heard military command reports on the situation in the oblast. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Colonel General Alexander Syrsky announced that Ukraine had established a military command office in the Kursk region to maintain law and order and to ensure the priority needs of the population. I'll discuss the developing situation in the Kursk region and the attitude of the Western allies to Kyiv's actions with my next guest in just a moment.
Ukrainian soldiers have expanded their control over parts of Russia's Kursk region. 10 days into the operation, the fighting in Kursk is still dynamic, in stark contrast to static trench warfare characterizing most of the front line in Ukraine. Kyiv stated that the purpose of the operation is to establish a security zone along its border, protecting regions neighboring Russia from attacks. Additionally, captured Russian territory could be exchanged for Russian-occupied lands in possible peace negotiations.
So far, Russia has not really called for negotiations, but for Ukraine's capitulation, which is obviously unacceptable to the Ukrainian side. At the moment, the negotiations are taking place on the battlefield.
The Ukrainian advance has led the governor of the Kursk region to order a mandatory evacuation of parts of the region. Tens of thousands of Russians have fled the fighting. Meanwhile, the neighboring Belgorod region has been put under a state of emergency. Ukrainian troops are now occupying more than 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory and are responsible for the civilian population living there. Kyiv is preparing for long-term occupation of the area.
To maintain law and order and provide for the basic needs of local residents in territories under Ukraine's control, a military commandant's office has been created, and Major General Edward Moskalyov has been appointed as its head.
Kyiv has stated that its troops are already supplying people living in the occupied area with food and other necessities. Ukraine is also planning to open humanitarian corridors allowing for the evacuation of civilians, both to Ukrainian territory and to the Russian-controlled areas.
And now joining me to break down what we can really learn and the biggest takeaways from the Kursk operation is George Barros, Russia Team and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio for the Institute for the Study of War. Hello, George, and thank you for joining us this week. We really appreciate it. Now, first off, we are well into the second week since Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. So, in your opinion, what is the bare minimum that Ukraine has already achieved?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think the key thing is that the Ukrainians have demonstrated the extent to which the Russians have availed themselves to sanctuary. That is, the policy of Western states that are supporting Ukraine and not enabling attacks on Russian soil, especially those that use American or foreign weapons and intelligence. Look, the Ukrainians in the course of the first week, they managed to penetrate quite deep. Over 25 kilometers in depth. They've managed to seize well over 800 square kilometers of territory. And it demonstrated the extent to which the entirety of the international border is not properly defended. There's about 1,000 kilometers between Belarus and the occupied part of eastern Ukraine and Kharkiv that the Russians, for the last 2 years, they treated it essentially as free real estate. And the Ukrainians now are imposing costs on that. And if the Russians, I think, do indeed take away the correct lesson, which is that they must now defend their border properly, lest they suffer more humiliations like this, that will drastically increase the costs for the Russians to sustain their war effort in the long term.
So with that large swath of border, I bet we can't eliminate any future operations in that area. Maybe perhaps this is really paying big dividends for Ukraine. They've been able to capture lots of soldiers, quite a bit of equipment, but there's still a lot we don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's to be determined exactly to what extent the Ukrainians are going to take this direction of this operation. There's been other forays and raids into Belgorod Oblast. There's been different axes of raids into Kursk in different locations from the main penetration that the Ukrainians have achieved. I anticipate that this operation will probably culminate in the coming weeks and months. I would be astonished if the Ukrainians kept moving, say, into the winter months. But that's not the point. The point here is to seize the initiative, which the Ukrainians have successfully done. The last year, the Russians have basically been dictating and serving up for the Ukrainians a buffet of dilemmas. The Ukrainians are on their back. How are they going to respond? And the Russians have been able to dictate the tempo of operations, the place and time, the intensity of which to attack the Ukrainians. And now, finally, for the first time since late 2023, the Ukrainians, they're contesting that. They're breaking out of it. They're no longer on their backs, and they're forcing the Russians to respond. And this operation is actually causing some substantial headaches for Moscow.
Now, we've seen this twice before, but in a little bit of a different version. Before it was the RDK and the Freedom of Russia Legion invading or making their incursion in the Belgorod region. This time around, looking at it from your optics, what is so special, what is so different about this latest operation on Ukrainians' behalf?
Sure. So the previous raids into Belgorod conducted by those pro-Ukrainian Russian volunteers was fundamentally a raid. That is, a raid is a specific tactical task that has built into the plan for the raid a retrograde. So the intent is not to go in and take territory and hold it for a protracted period. Like, you're going in, you're killing and capturing or doing reconnaissance, and then you plan to leave and get out of there pretty quickly. This operation that we see now is not a tactical task. It's at a fundamentally higher level of war. This is a campaign. This is an operational level undertaking. And we know that from the duration of the operation, the size and scale of the operation, and the kinds of units and the specific types of tasks that we see Ukrainians undertaking. We have substantial amounts of heavy armored vehicles operating here within Kursk. We have gotten imagery of the Ukrainians pulling up American M777 artillery howitzers and placing those in the firing positions into Kursk. And then we've also seen the Russians reporting that the Ukrainians are digging field fortifications in Kursk as well, right? These all are indicators that suggest, but I don't know for a fact what the Ukrainian game plan here is, but they suggest that the Ukrainians seek to conduct a longer operation that to hopefully, get the Russians to bring up some significant combat power and bring it up to them and away from the theater.
Now, this operation has proved that the only red lines for Russia could be as far back as the Red Square. Ukraine has been adamant about the West allowing it to use its weapons, and especially in this incursion, trying to tell Western leaders, like, look, we have the ability to go on a counteroffensive. Please let us use your weapons without restrictions. So in this case, what is it exactly? Which weapons are the Ukrainians talking about that they're unable to use? Because, I mean, when we see some of these images coming out of the Kursk region, we're seeing a lot of different pieces of Western supplied equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. The policy that the Ukrainians are gunning for now, and rightly what they should change, is the prohibitions on long-range precision fires, specifically for the Americans, the ATACMS missiles. The U.S. has provided Ukraine ATACMS, two varieties, one with a range of 170 kilometers and another one with a range of 300 kilometers. And currently, U.S. policy imposes strict rules of engagement that categorically forbid Ukraine from using either of those weapons anywhere in the territory of the Russian Federation. They can only use them within occupied Ukraine. This operation in Kursk is very interesting because I think, and I don't know for a fact, but I suspect not entirely with the White House's blessing, we've had Ukrainian mechanized forces rolling around with American-provided strikers. We've seen German mechanized vehicles operating here as well. There were even some French and Italian vehicles observed too. And then, of course, we had artillery operating within Kursk. And there was even on August 9th a reported Ukrainian HIMARS strike, a different type of rocket artillery with a range lesser than that of ATACMS. But your point stands, which is we have an unprecedented scale of military combined arms operations operating on no-kidding Russian soil. And Moscow, very interestingly, did not declare a state of war against Ukraine, did not declare martial law, but instead took many days to then declare a special counter-terrorist operation headed up by not the military, but the internal police, the Russian FSB. This, I think, suggests that in order to argue that we cannot allow the Ukrainians to conduct precision deep fires, 300 kilometers deep into Russia, because that's going to lead to some sort of catastrophic escalation, I think that's becoming increasingly indefensible. I mean, it requires a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance, given the scale of the operation that we have in Kursk, to argue that we can't allow the Ukrainians to take the war to Russia, because it's not going to lead to nuclear escalation. It'll be a horizontal escalation, a continuation of conventional combat operations.
Now, if Ukraine had access, full use of those weapons, do you think it would make a big difference on what they can achieve there in the Kursk region?
Excellent question. I think restricting the rules of engagement on the long-range fires is not going to have an immediate impact on Kursk, but it will have a large impact on Russia's entire war machine for the entirety of the theater. So if you were, for example, to look at a map, and our institutes publish such maps, of just the known Russian military infrastructure that exists within 300 kilometers of around Ukraine, where the Ukrainians, in theory, could take out such objects, you have no fewer than 16 Russian military air bases, no fewer than 250 known military objects. Those are ammunition depots, fuel depots, vehicle repair and storage bases, command and control bunkers, headquarters, like all of the necessary logistical and military infrastructure footprint that you use to conduct large-scale operations. Those are arrayed in around Ukraine. And if the Ukrainians were allowed to go and strike and target those objects, then number one, you'd get to be able to, I think, destroy a significant amount of Russian equipment that's difficult to replace. Number two, you would force a decision point on the Kremlin, which is, are we going to actually now invest more resources to disperse, withdraw further back from the front line, and cover and protect these assets, including, by the way, redeploying very rare Russian electronic warfare and air defense systems, which are currently arrayed just to cover the frontline parts of Ukraine. And then number three, how are the Russians going to be able to sustain their forces without having these big, large bases? When the Russians have the benefit the luxury of having these large staging grounds not too far away from their front lines, then they can haul a whole bunch of fuel and ammunition and all number of ordnance to their frontline forces. But if we make them have to transverse it across a 300-kilometer range, they have to morselize their things. They can't benefit from scales of economy, and it stands to substantially degrade Russia's ability projecting force at scale.
Now, some would say that this will help, that this incursion in the Kursk region will help Ukraine in the hot spots along the eastern front line. Do you see any evidence that this is indeed the case, perhaps taking some pressure off of Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk direction, Chasiv Yar, maybe even near Vovchansk, which is close to the Kursk region at this time, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, it's too early to tell, I think. However, for what it's worth, from open sources, we have not seen evidence of the Russians redeploying forces from the key priority areas of the front, like you named, near Chasiv Yar, near Pokrovsk. The Russian command is redeploying some forces from other parts of the theater, but those seem to be coming from lower priority parts of the line. We've seen the Russians redeploy airborne guys from the 104th Division near Kherson. We've seen some, brigades pulled from far eastern Russia that were previous on the Zaporizhzhia line being redeployed as well. You mentioned Vovchansk and Kharkiv. We actually have seen some elements of the Moscow First Guards tank army being redeployed from the Kharkiv direction to go respond to Kursk. So they're taking what they can from the lower priority parts of the theater, but interestingly, that key priority theater and the one where the Russians continue making the most rapid gains at Donetsk, the Russian command seems unwilling to take those forces away from their current objectives.
Yeah, and that'll still prove to be a difficult situation for Ukrainians concerning that area. Now, in your opinion, is this, well, actually, first, I wanted to get here. If we look at the Ukrainian forces that are in the Kursk region, these seem to be, on the surface, actually experienced units. These aren't just new recruits. At least that's what it looks like. So do you think that there could be a mismatch between the abilities, say, of the Ukrainians being far superior in their experience to what the Russians are going to throw at them in the Kursk region?
Yeah, the Ukrainian command has decided to send some of their best units. There's some airborne units that are operating there, well-equipped, well-experienced guys. So essentially what the Ukrainians are doing is they're exploiting a weakness in the Russian line, one of the weakest parts on the Russian line, and sending in their best forces, which is why the Ukrainians have performed so well over the first coming days. Judging the effectiveness of the Russian response is going to be a key research question for us at the Institute over the coming days and weeks. It's very telling to us that the Russians have decided to create this unorthodox joint command center, command and control command for the forces that will be conducting the so-called counter-terrorist operation. Mm-hmm. That is very interestingly not being headed up by the Russian military, the principal organization that should be responsible for undertaking such a counter operation against a mechanized force. It's instead going to be led by the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, under Bortnikov. And what's very interesting is that Bortnikov will have the unique challenge of having to pull together into this unorthodox command a variety of different Russian power structures and different paramilitary forces that come from disparate chains of command. So, Bortnikov is going to have to bring in FSB border guards, conscripts from the conventional Russian military, as well as conventional Russian military units, as well as unconventional Russian irregular forces. He's going to have to pull in elements from the Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia, which, unlike most Western countries, the Russian National Guard is not part of the military, but it's actually directly subordinated to President Putin's presidential administration in the Kremlin, because it's Putin's Praetorian Guard more so than anything else, as well as Ministry of Interior forces. These different guys all come from different chains. They're not used to conducting large-scale combat operations together in a combined joint command. And so it's, given that all the command and control challenges that the conventional Russian military has when just dealing with their own forces, it's unclear to us how Bortnikov is going to be able to effectively marshal so many different services in one area in space-time.
Well, that's going to be very interesting to see how it works out. And of course, traditionally, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. I'd like to ask you about the prisoners that have been taken, the prisoners of war that have been captured en masse. Looks like probably a couple hundred of them, although we don't know the numbers. And there are reports out there that Russia is already in negotiations to get them back. What do you do at this point if you're Ukraine? Do you trade one Russian for 5 Ukrainians, or do you wait? How is Ukraine going to play this to the best of their advantage?
Yeah, it's unclear to me exactly how the Ukrainians are going to do this. The Russians have routinely always complained about how the trade ratios are not in Russian favor. They usually don't always achieve a 1-to-1 person ratio, which is good for the Ukrainians. What I think is actually more interesting is the potential political crisis that these particular prisoners of war could generate for the Kremlin, in particular as the Ukrainian operation protracts and they get more prisoners. These prisoners in particular, some of them are conscripts. And as you and your listeners might know, conscripts are extremely politically sensitive for the Kremlin. They long have been throughout the late Soviet period. There's a lot of ink that's been written about, the concerned mothers movements of the late Soviet period, about how the Russian state would take conscripts and, lose them in expeditionary wars in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And Putin is very sensitive to this. There was a huge scandal in early 2022 when Putin lied and told the Russian population that conscripts would not be fighting in Ukraine in the special military operation. And when they found that was false, that conscripts had indeed been deployed and had been killed and captured, Putin had to do a lot of damage control. And he rightfully withdrew the conscripts. And there had been a couple, rare instances where conscripts had fought in Ukraine since then. But for the large part, they had been extricated from combat. Putin last year made a decision to allow conscripts to serve in the FSB border guard service. And then, of course, there are conscript units that do their service within the Russian Federation without leaving there. Well, when the Ukrainians charged into Kursk Oblast and they punctured the lines and went 20 kilometers deep in a very short amount of time, they ran into those FSB border guard units that have conscripts. And they also ran into the regular Russian military units that have conscripts. And some of those conscripts are killed and captured. And right now, there's an internal debate within Russia about to what extent are they going to tolerate casualties amongst conscripts, and how is Putin going to leverage the conscripts that are in different neighboring Russian regions and deploy them to Ukraine. At current, the Kremlin seems to be taking on some more accumulated risk, and they are sending more conscripts to go fight and respond to the incursion into Kursk Oblast. And it'll be very interesting to see whether or not, like it has in previous decades, whether or not the Russian population will reject losses amongst conscripts.
Yes, sir. Well, George Barros, Russia team in Geospatial intelligence lead there at the Russia-Ukraine portfolio for the Institute of the Study of War. Thank you very much for your analysis. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Don. Always a pleasure speaking.
And now we move on to sport. Ukraine Sport Minister Matvey Bidny claims that the Russians wanted his country to cease to exist. But more than 2 years after the invasion, the Paris Olympics proved that the opposite happened. We'll talk about the essence of the Olympic Games for a country gripped by the horrors of war in just a moment.
3 gold, 5 silver and 4 bronze, a total of 12. This is how many medals Ukrainian athletes brought back from Paris. They made it to the podium in boxing, hammer throw, canoeing, fencing, gymnastics, shooting and artistic swimming. Ukrainian athletes competing in Paris kept the suffering of their country close to heart.
I dedicate the victory to our hero city of Irpin because of the people who were there, who survived those terrible times, the occupation. How many lives were destroyed, how many houses were destroyed, including mine and my family's, and how many people died. It's very scary. I would like to cheer them up with this medal and remember everyone who was rooting for me.
4 years ago, the Ukrainian team won more medals, a total of 19. This time, their capacity for victories was greatly diminished by the losses suffered in wartime. Athletes are more likely to die during war, as many serve in the armed forces. Ukrainian authorities currently put the number of athletes killed in the war with Russia at 487. Among them was Serhiy Pronevich, a marathon runner killed in the early days of the war.
He was in some kind of territorial defense unit. He reported where the Russian tanks were or something. He was in some reconnaissance group. It turned out to be either an ambush or the Russians were in fact there and there was, as they say, a shooting.
Other athletes had their training disrupted due to displacement. As long as the war lasts, the Ukrainian Olympic team will not be able to rebuild its full potential.
And now here to discuss the impact of the Olympics on a country gripped by war, I'd like to welcome Maria Ianova, Ukrainian MP. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting. Good evening. And of course, thank you for raising such important topic for our nation and for our country in such horrible times.
Yes, well, I'd like to ask right away, I mean, what does it mean for a warring country to have its athletes represent, participate in sporting events, especially as one as big in magnitude as the Olympics?
I can say that Ukraine has always been a sport nation, and sports achievements are an important component of our national identity and pride. And of course, the preparations of Ukrainian athletes for the Paris Olympics took place in really extremely difficult conditions. Eventually, our Ukrainian Olympic team, we know that they took 22nd place in a medal table. Even in peacetime, I think that it could be considered really as a good result. But in that conditions, which we are now, a full-scale invasion by Russia Federation, of course, this is indeed an amazing achievement. And to your question, this tragic context, I think that on the one hand, united the Ukrainian Olympians, and on the other hand, imposed such additional responsibility of them, because usually a medal at the Olympics, it's always a personal success, but I think in our case, in Ukrainian case, each medal, each podium became first and fairmost a success for Ukraine, for our country, a symbol of the invictability of Ukrainians, invisibility, of the Ukrainians who can win despite the circumstances. And we really appreciate all the messaging what our Ukrainian sport men and women were announced, and of course they thanked and they are thankful to our Ukrainian armed forces. And I think that our athletes, as also we see on TV, they were all the time in ways of Ukraine. In addition to the sport itself, they played really an important role when they were such advocates and communicators with the Western mass media, conveying the truth, really the truth about Russia aggression in Ukraine. And of course, they were advocating and also commented for the viewers from all over the world, especially probably those who may not be interested in politics and in global security.
Maria Ianova, Ukrainian MP, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. We appreciate it. And that's all on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.